So I speak here essentially as a director of Strive Afghanistan. I'm trying to present some of the findings and experiences that we accumulated over a number of years for a project that is actually about to end. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'm actually going to spend quite a bit of my time trying to explain the way the Islamic State in Khorasan operates in terms of propaganda, especially propaganda online. The reason for this, despite the title of my presentation, is that I do think that these efforts to disrupt and redirect the activities of violent extremists have to be tailored to what different types or different groups actually do, because there are differences, of course, and there are also differences in the context where these groups operate. So the more tailored an effort is, the more likely it is to actually succeed or to achieve some kind of impact. So first of all, let's discuss briefly the operation of the Khorasan branch of the Islamic State online, especially Afghanistan, because we focus on Afghanistan, but we know they also operate in a similar way, for example, in Central Asia. So we do believe, even if we haven't specifically studied this, that the propaganda techniques deployed by the Islamic State Khorasan branch are derived from those of other branches of the organization. This is actually a relatively recent effort. In the early years of the Khorasan branch, 2015, 16, 17, there was actually very little propaganda at all happening online or offline. And then it started taking off, especially uh, after August 2021. So after the Taliban takeover in Kabul, there was a gap of a few months, but then there was a very massive increase in the activities of the Islamic State in Khorasan online on social media. And I think we can describe the online or social media activities of the Islamic State in Khorasan and the aims essentially in this way. First of all, of course, the aim is to distribute propaganda to whoever might be interested, and that's pretty obvious. But importantly, they use their social media activities to attract recruits as well, and this is an important consideration. And also something that has emerged even more recently in the last several months, to keep the organization together. And this is because largely the Khorasan branch in Afghanistan has gone underground during 2023, already starting last year. It means that it doesn't control territory anymore, and is essentially composed of cells, underground cells spread around the country. The country is not small. Khorasan is not a huge organization. So they do face an issue of keeping the organization together in the sense of creating some kind of esprit de corps, or giving a sense to the members and isolated members or isolated cells that there is a community, and the community can only be, of course, online. Um, and this is not, this is relevant, of course, to our work, but not only, because this is a trend that can be seen in a number of other locations. In Central Asia, of course, the Islamic State has never been controlling any territory. All its activities have been underground. So this model certainly applies very well to Central Asia as well. But now increasingly, you can see this type of operations not only in Turkey and other countries where they never held any territory, but also in Syria and Iraq, where they lost the territory they used to control, and now they largely operate underground. And of course, the more successful campaigns to destroy the organized presence of the Islamic State in various regions and countries are, the more they will turn to underground operation, and more reliant they will be on social media and online activities. Um, so, for example, what does it mean is in practice, we noted that they've been using social media to distribute messages and warnings to members, as well to kind of try to foster a sense of something that exists, or kind of mythical existence of a kind of caliphate, or an Islamic state, really in terms of territorial control, with narratives, with practical examples, memoirs of people. And of course, these don't exist anymore. It existed at some point, but it doesn't exist anymore. But this is presented in the propaganda as something that still exists. And of course, in terms of morale of the organization, this idea that somewhere, even in a remote location, there is still this kind of um, entity where one could potentially seek refuge and meet his comrade in arms is quite important, I think, or at least the propagandists of the Islamic State seem to think is quite important. So we actually, as a team, as a Strive Afghanistan team, we're largely focused on the first two purposes because the third one has emerged recently. And of course, as you can imagine, to set up any program of disruption, redirection takes time, not only because you need to design it, but then there are bureaucratic and administrative issues that you have to confront when you try to implement any kind of project. Next slide, please. Now, an important discovery that we were not aware when we started, we carried out a lot of research on the activities of the Islamic State um, in Afghanistan. We discovered that the Khorasan branch has been largely integrating its activities online with those offline. So the original model of activity that they adopted was to complement the two. So I have a lot of social media activity, of course, but also uh, do face-to-face recruitment, of course, in a cautious way. And we, in particular, studied the activities in Afghanistan's university campuses, where they've been quite active, and especially the Islamic law faculty, but also other faculties. And so we have figured out that the two complemented each other quite well, that they're very well designed system with dedicated teams for the different stages of the recruitment process, with online teams and local teams doing face-to-face recruitment, cooperating very closely with each other in a coordinated way, suggesting that this is not just happening by chance, but it's been designed as such and probably evolved over time to take this shape. And certainly, of course, it's difficult to judge how effective this combined efforts or hybrid effort has been, because, of course, any data about recruitment is always difficult to get, and even if you get it, it's difficult or impossible to verify. But certainly, the sources that we were able to contact had a sense that this hybrid effort is a most effective way to recruit, because recruiting exclusively online is difficult, because of course at some point these people need to be to see an individual, to be contacted by an individual to complete the recruitment process. Difficult to complete the recruit remotely, and also these isolated recruits that might exist in various locations are very difficult then to integrate into the organization, even they do join on the basis of online recruitment. So the idea or the perception was that combining the two was very effective. So, and this, for what we know from the limited hard evidence we could gather on this point, they would tend to agree. And then certainly they were quite persistent. They took their cells in the university took considerable risk to continue recruiting face to face, because the Taliban, of course, they also were aware of this recruitment going on in the campuses and invested considerable human resource in trying to block that and try to detain the militants in the campuses. Um, and typically they targeted individuals with a certain profile, so they wouldn't go for whoever could have some remote interest in the Islamic State for any range of reasons. Clearly, this is an organization that tends to recruit highly motivated individuals who could serve as card of the organization. So, in a sense, they have, if you like, a bit of a Leninist approach. Few are better. Few good ones are better than many mediocre or not fully convinced members. So, for example, they targeted students with the Salafi, or what we could describe crypto Salafi profile. So people didn't consider themselves Salafi, but that ideas that boarded Salafis, especially Salafi jihadis. Um, Individuals also who had a track record of clashing with the fellow students or with the teaching staff at the university over issues related to religion, for example. So there were, if you like, spies or informers monitoring the behavior of students that were then targeted for recruitment by the cells. And also individuals who had experience of being harassed directly by Taliban security, detention, abuse in prison, or had relatives like brothers, fathers targeted in the repression. And finally, uh, more in general, individuals who were believed by friends or colleagues to be ideologically disposed to recruitment. Now, the way the Islamic State appears to operate is very sophisticated. So essentially, they committed even months of work on a single individual to study the individual. Once identified as a suitable recruit, they would gather information about him, including contact details for following up. Um, and then individuals would start being fed through their smartphones material, first more religious material, mostly Salafi literature or Salafi video or uh, preachers delivering speeches in various locations, etc. So videos, and then gradually more and more political material. So a gradual process extended over times, weeks and even months of gradual testing on the ground, and individuals who did not respond positively to this material, they would be dropped. So only those who responded positively would then be fed the more and more political material in the next stages of the recruitment process. So this is of course a recruitment process that would yield only a limited number of recruits. As I mentioned, it seems clear that the Islamic State, the priority for them is to recruit a card or maintain a card structure, maintain and expand a card structure, which is the cornerstone of their uh, way or the way they operate. So first of all, you need to have this structure, very motivated, well trained, educated, and then the rest, the bulk of the members may be there or not, depending on the situation. They are also willing, in some situation, even to drop common members, non-educated members. But for them, this infrastructure is essential for the way they operate, for the survival of the organization. Next slide, please. So then the question, of course, is overall how effective all this was. As I mentioned, this is never easy to assess. Um, we believe that certain numbers have been given are realistic because they are not very high, and we also taken snapshots of their social media activities. We're able to estimate the number of individuals who were at a given point, say in a particular week of spring 23, who were flirting, if you like, with online recruiters, for example. So then we have some idea of the extent um, of this recruitment process and of what kind of volume can generate. And the overall extent of this activity, at least when we did our research, was over 50 Facebook groups being used for this purpose, with some being uh, clearly identifiable as linked to the Islamic State, and others instead spreading a mix of material where Islamic State content was relatively modest but still present. And in terms of the numbers that we could um, estimate were being affected by this effort, we believe that at the same date, roughly 150 individuals were engaging with this content. Doesn't mean at this point, because of the recruitment process, doesn't mean that all those 150 would eventually join the Islamic State. Some would be dropped because they were not fully, were deemed not to be fully reliable, etc. But say in the space of a week, we could identify around 150 individuals who were engaging with the Facebook pages. Um, then, in terms of actual recruitment, we only could get figures from Islamic State sources themselves, so of course that to be taken with a pinch of salt inevitably. But the numbers, as I said, are not so high that you would tendentially question them, because essentially when you put together different numbers we got from different campuses, you have a range of 100 to 200 recruits per year, which I think is realistic. Otherwise, without this volume of recruits, the Islamic State in Khorasan would not have survived as a viable organization. Next slide, please.
Can I also ask you to keep it to 3 minutes so we
Sure.
don't run completely out of time?
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. So the overall, of course, one of the reasons why we decided to intervene is also that this activity of the Islamic State, as I say in this slide, at the Islamic State at the needed time, the Taliban were effective in conventional counterterrorism, busting cells, etc., financial disruption, but they were not very effective online. They were a bit out of the depth in terms of countering Islamic State activities online. Of course, apart from the Taliban, nobody else was trying to do that. And so I think because I'm running out of time, I will move to the next slide, which is the next slide, please. This is essentially our main lesson that we have been drawing from this. Um, and primarily, um, one of the biggest problems we face in our effort was to redirect individuals who were already essentially sympathizing for the Islamic State. So, in fact, these are the people who are most at risk. You can see clearly that they are inclined towards joining, or at least they're moving that direction. And it's very difficult to attract them to look at other material that you might feed to them. And we, at the rule, we were not feeding disinformation or anything. We're feeding actual news, actual, real material, genuine information about the Islamic State and other issues. But the challenge was to actually get them to read the stuff. And we can see from, for example, the videos we offer to them, that many will start watching the video, and then when they realize that it was basically going against their prejudice or their conviction, they would drop out. They would stop watching pretty soon. Um, so that means that, for example, some approaches that are taken in terms of trying to intervene on social media risk not being very effective, is there is a sense that, or if they are, it cannot be identified as coming from hostile sources. So, for example, a big discussion we had was whether we should, in our um, online training, to train students essentially in dealing with propaganda more effectively. One big discussion we had was whether we should also include examples of American propaganda or Russian propaganda or whatever, but not exclusively Islamic State or violent extremist organization propaganda. Because of course, when you do that, this kind of already almost hostile viewers, they are put off. They immediately start thinking they're only talking about, and they're not talking about Israel. They're talking about Islamic State. It's clear where this is coming from. And this debate is a difficult one, of course, because there are a lot of issues involved. But we think that without something in going this direction, it's very difficult to achieve a considerable degree of success in this field. And um, and of course, one would have, as a, thinking forward with significant resource and time, one would have to think of how to offer the students some alternatives. We've been doing mostly disruption, essentially, or redirection, but essentially we didn't present any positive alternative or substantial alternative to Islamic State in terms of appeal, in terms of future. I think without that, it's difficult to have long-term success. But of course, there's a big engagement. You have to do a lot of thinking. You need the resources to do something like that, to offer the kind of alternatives. And this is something that we, because of the limited scope of our project, we couldn't do. So, for example, we consider the idea of courses for individual with an entrepreneurial attitude, trying to help them to think in terms of uh, creating their own, micro business somewhere. Considering many of these are, of course, educated, may have a degree in engineering or whatever. But if we didn't have the ability, the resources to do anything significant in that direction. And I think I ran out of time, so I will stop here. Thank you.